All right, so picture this for a second. Viking longships slicing through icy waves, that bone-deep drum beat pounding as warriors charge onto foreign shores. You've seen that part 100 times in movies, right? But here's the part almost nobody talks about. The moment the flames died down and the raiders looked over the ruins of a village, that's when the real nightmare began for the captured women. These weren't just prizes of war. To the Vikings, these women were currency, leverage, status symbols, and in the darkest corners of Norse society, offerings. Behind every Viking saga you've ever heard, behind the glory, the exploration, the legendary battles, there's this hidden world of brutal reality. Countless women were torn from their homes in Ireland, England, the Slavic regions, and everywhere the longships landed. Some were worked to the bone as thralls. Others were forced into the homes and beds of powerful men. Some were traded across continents like merchandise. And in the most horrifying cases, a few were sent into the afterlife as ritual sacrifices. And the crazy part? Their stories weren't lost. They're tucked into ancient laws, sagas, chronicles, archaeological finds, quiet pieces of evidence revealing a truth the legends rarely show. These women weren't passive footnotes in Viking history. They were central to how the Norse built power, wealth, families, alliances, and fear. So buckle up, because once you see what actually happened to the women captured by Vikings, the entire Viking story hits very differently.
The moment those villages fell silent after a raid, everything changed for the women who survived. Their freedom vanished in an instant, replaced by a new identity the Vikings had crafted long before they ever set foot on foreign soil. These women, many from Ireland, England, and the Slavic lands, were dragged onto longships and thrust into the lowest rung of Norse society. The Vikings had a word for this brutal status: thrall. And once you were labeled a thrall, there was no misunderstanding what your life was going to look like. Thrown into Viking households, these women were expected to keep everything running day in, day out. We're talking non-stop work, cooking over smoky fires, hauling water in the freezing cold, grinding grain for hours, tending to children who weren't their own, and breaking their backs in agriculture and textile labor. And the wild part? Ancient Icelandic texts, like the Landnama book, literally mention these women by status, showing just how woven into daily Viking life they were. But they weren't treated like people. They were treated like tools, passed around, traded, even gifted away to curry favor or strengthen alliances. And it gets darker. Viking law codes like the Gulathing law made it painfully clear that a thrall wasn't considered human in the eyes of the law. A master could punish or even kill a thrall without consequences. Their children inherited that same status automatically, trapping entire generations in the same brutal cycle. Sure, a tiny handful of thralls were occasionally freed, becoming freedmen or freedwomen, but even then, they were stuck at the bottom of the social ladder with almost no real power. But here's where the story shifts, because as harsh as thrall life was, not every captured woman ended up doing back-breaking labor.
Even though countless women were forced into the brutal life of a thrall, some were pulled into a completely different kind of fate, one that looked more comfortable on the surface, but carried its own kind of darkness. When powerful chieftains or wealthy Viking men captured women during raids in places like Ireland and Scotland, they didn't always send them to the fields or the loom. Sometimes these women were kept as concubines, becoming secondary partners inside a household already ruled by a legitimate wife. And here's the thing, this wasn't some rare exception. The sagas themselves, like Egil's saga and Laxdæla's saga, casually mention concubines the same way you'd mention livestock or property. These women could have children who shaped family politics, stirred jealousy, and shifted the power balance within the home. But no matter how close they lived to privilege, they weren't equals. They weren't wives. They had no legal protection. Their lives depended entirely on the man who owned them. But Vikings weren't just raiders. They were settlers. As they spread into the British Isles, they realized marriage could be a weapon just as sharp as a sword. So they married local women, not for romance, for land, for alliances, for influence. It was all strategy. And modern science actually backs this up. DNA pulled from early Icelandic graves shows that a huge portion of the women who helped populate Iceland were of Celtic origin. That means the stories weren't exaggerating. These captured women didn't just survive Viking society, they became part of its foundation. But even with marriage and concubinage reshaping Norse families, Vikings still saw many captured women as something far more transactional.
After the Vikings took what they wanted in battle or through settlement, there was another brutal layer to their system, one that turned captured women into pure economic leverage. And honestly, this part hits hard because it shows just how calculated Viking power really was. When raids swept through England or Francia, Viking warriors didn't just storm villages looking for loot, they were also hunting for value, and sometimes that value came in the form of noble women. These women weren't dragged into households or forced into servitude. Instead, they became bargaining chips. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle lays out chilling examples of families paying enormous ransoms, silver, gold, livestock, whatever it took to get their daughters or wives back. For Viking chieftains, this wasn't just extra cash, it was political power, status, and a reputation that made future raids even more terrifying. But here's the heartbreaking twist. Most women weren't high-born, and without wealthy families desperate to rescue them, their fate took a darker turn. Instead of going home, they were marched into the massive slave networks that stretched from Scandinavia deep into the Middle East. Historical records like the Russ Primary Chronicle describe Viking traders navigating river routes into Eastern Europe, carrying captives toward markets buzzing with buyers from Constantinople to the Abbasid Caliphate. Ahmed ibn Fadlan, whose writings give us one of the rawest windows into Viking life, talks about slave markets along the Volga River where women were exchanged for silver, silk, spices, you name it. Imagine being captured in your village one week and sold in a foreign market thousands of miles away the next. It's terrifying. This part of Viking culture wasn't about heroism or honor. It was about profit, pure, cold, transactional profit. And it showed how far the Vikings would go to maintain their growing influence across continents. But as dark as this trade network was, there was an even chilling fate some women faced, one tied not to wealth or labor, but to Viking religious belief itself.
Picking up from that vast trade network, things shift into territory that feels almost unreal. Because for some captured women, their fate wasn't labor, concubinage, or even being sold across continents. It was something far more disturbing, tied directly to Viking spiritual beliefs. And what went down in these rituals doesn't just sound brutal, it sounds otherworldly. In Norse culture, warfare, death, and religion were tightly woven together. So when a powerful Viking leader died, the people around him didn't just mourn, they prepared for a journey into the afterlife that, in their minds, required company. And sometimes that company was a captured woman. The most detailed account of this comes from Ahmed ibn Fadlan, the Arab traveler who witnessed a Viking funeral along the Volga River in 922. What he describes is shocking even by modern standards. A female slave was chosen to accompany her master in death, expected to serve him in whatever waited beyond. She didn't get a choice. For days, she was given intoxicating drinks, not out of kindness, but to weaken her fear and resistance. Then the ritual took an even darker turn. As part of the ceremony, the woman was assaulted by several men, a horrifying act meant to symbolize something. Strength? Ownership? No one truly knows. But what we do know is this. The ritual ended when an elder priestess, chillingly referred to as the Angel of Death, strangled and stabbed her, sending her into the afterlife beside her dead master. Ibn Fadlan's account isn't some exaggerated myth. It's a first-hand description that gives us a rare, unfiltered look at the extremes of Viking ritual. But he wasn't the only one to hint at these practices. Rimbert's Vita Ansgari mentions sacrifices during religious festivals, especially for high-ranking leaders. Not every story is as detailed, though, which leaves historians debating just how widespread these sacrifices really were. Archaeology only muddies the waters further. Take the Oseberg burial in Norway. 2 women laid to rest together, and one showed signs of violent death. Was she an honored attendant or a sacrificial victim? People are still arguing. Excavations at sites like Trelleborg in Denmark show signs that ritual killings may have happened there too, but nothing is 100% definitive. Still, when you look at the sagas, the chronicles, the graves, and the rituals, one thing becomes painfully clear. For some women captured by Vikings, the end wasn't slavery or ransom, it was death, ritualistic, ceremonial, and horrifying. But here's the part that really ties everything together. These women weren't just victims. They were twisted into the structure of Viking society itself, socially, economically, and spiritually. And that final realization brings the whole story into focus.
When Viking warriors fathered children with captive women, the question of what happened next wasn't simple. In fact, it split in 2 very different directions, one shaped by survival, the other by hard social rules. If a Viking man chose to acknowledge the child, everything changed. That child wasn't treated as an outsider. They became a full member of the household. Stories preserved in Icelandic sagas mention children born of foreign mothers, being raised just like any other kid in the settlement. They could inherit property, hold status, and even grow up to become warriors or traders themselves. Viking society had its brutal sides, but when a father claimed a child, bloodline was bloodline. That meant belonging. But the darker path? That came when the father didn't acknowledge the child. In that case, the child followed the status of the mother, which often meant growing up enslaved. Some were traded, others worked in fields, households, or workshops. Their future depended entirely on how the captors viewed their usefulness. No rights, no protections. Just labor. And here's the cruel paradox. Even though Viking men fathered many of these children, written records show little concern about their fates unless the men saw social or economic value in them. It was practical, not personal. Still, there were exceptions that reveal how complex Viking households could be. Some captives eventually gained freedom or were integrated slowly, especially if they proved loyal, skilled, or beneficial to the family's honor. And their children sometimes rose with them. Viking society might have been unforgiving, but it wasn't rigid. Opportunity and brutality lived side by side. Now, let's step into the most disturbing twist of all. What Viking beliefs meant for women who died in bondage, and why some scholars think the afterlife the Vikings imagined was far more terrifying for captives than for warriors.
By now, it's clear the Vikings weren't just raiders or traders. They were master strategists who understood something far deeper than brute strength. Fear is a weapon, and when it came to women captured in raids, the Vikings used that weapon with precision. Think about the panic that spread across Anglo-Saxon towns and Carolingian settlements. The moment someone shouted "Northmen," entire communities knew what might follow. Homes burned, families scattered, and women taken. Word of Viking brutality traveled faster than the longships themselves. Chroniclers in Francia described villages that surrendered without a single sword being raised because the reputation of Viking cruelty was more powerful than any blade. But it wasn't just physical fear they cultivated. It was psychological domination. Every culture they encountered understood what it meant for women to be taken, and the Vikings weaponized that understanding. In societies where
family honor, inheritance, and lineage were everything. Kidnapping women wasn't just an attack on the individual, it was an attack on the entire social fabric. It destabilized noble families, undermined alliances, and forced kings to negotiate from a position of weakness. And here's the clever part. The Vikings knew that not every woman they captured would be kept, sold, or ransomed. Some were taken for the symbol of their power alone. A signal to rulers everywhere that the Vikings could reach into the heart of their land and take the people they valued most. That message was loud enough to reshape political decisions for decades, from coastal defenses to taxation systems to emergency military levies. Even the sagas, written long after the Viking Age, preserve whispers of this terror. They speak of raids where women vanished without trace, and the fear those stories planted in future generations. Fear that outlived the raiders themselves. So when we look back at how the Vikings expanded their influence across Europe, it wasn't their axes alone that carved their empire. It was the psychological shockwaves they sent through every society they touched.
For centuries, the stories of women taken by Viking raiders came from chronicles, written by terrified monks, ambitious kings, or travelers who saw only part of the truth. But in the last few decades, the ground itself has started telling its own story, and honestly, it's far more unsettling. Across Scandinavia, England, and the Baltic, archaeologists have uncovered burial sites where the bodies tell a tale that written records never dared to describe. At an excavation in Derbyshire, England, researchers uncovered several female skeletons dated to the Viking Age, women who showed signs of being foreign to the region. Their teeth revealed they grew up hundreds of miles away, but their bones showed something else: malnutrition, abrupt lifestyle changes, and in some cases, violent injuries. These weren't settlers, these were captives. In Norway and Denmark, multiple graves contain women buried without typical Viking adornments, no brooches, beads, or personal items. Instead, they were laid to rest almost anonymously, sometimes with iron restraints nearby. It's a haunting contrast to the richly furnished graves Viking women normally received. These were people who lived and died in the shadows of the culture. Even more disturbing are findings along the Volga River and in Icelandic farmsteads, where archaeological layers show a sudden influx of foreign women's remains during major raiding periods. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidence. It lines up perfectly with known slave trading routes used by Norse merchants. These women weren't travelers. They were taken, transported, and absorbed into remote communities far from home. But the most chilling discovery, evidence from coastal mass graves, suggests that not every captive survived long enough to be sold or assimilated. Some were killed shortly after raids, possibly because they resisted, were injured, or simply weren't considered valuable. It's a brutal, unfiltered reminder that behind the myths of Viking adventure and glory were countless human stories that ended without mercy. And now that we have followed the archaeological trail, there's one final, devastating question to tackle.
For many women, survival meant compliance, but some tried to fight their way out, and the Vikings had very specific ways of dealing with escaped captives, and none of them were merciful. Norse societies valued loyalty and oath-keeping above almost everything, so when an enslaved or captured woman attempted to flee, the Vikings viewed it not just as disobedience, but as a direct attack on the honor of the household or chieftain who claimed ownership, and the response made sure others learned from the example. Archaeological evidence from settlements like Rebay and Hedeby shows women who were shackled with iron ankle rings so heavy they dragged on the ground. These devices weren't just restraints, they were punishments meant to be worn for life, a permanent reminder of the consequences of trying to run. In the sagas, escape attempts were met with swift, brutal retribution. One Icelandic saga describes a woman who fled during winter only to be tracked through the snow by dogs. When she was caught, her captors didn't kill her. They maimed her, ensuring she could never run again. That detail alone tells you how much the Vikings prioritized utility over cruelty, or maybe both. But the darkest accounts come from the eastern trade routes. Travelers like Ibn Fadlan wrote about slaves who tried to run and were dragged back to camp, beaten, and left tied to wooden stakes as a warning. Some were sold immediately at the next market, not because they were valuable, but because their owners didn't want disobedience contaminating the rest rest of the group. And yet, despite all of this, stories survived of women who managed to escape permanently. Some found refuge in Christian monasteries, others fled into forests, joining small outlaw bands that lived between worlds. A few were even ransomed by chance when a traveling priest recognized them. Their victories were rare, but they existed. And for those women, freedom wasn't just an escape, it was a rebirth.
Looking at everything together, it's impossible to ignore the full picture. The women captured by Vikings weren't just collateral damage. They were central to the power, wealth, and social order of Norse society. From the fields where thralls labored under the bitter northern sun, to households where concubines quietly influenced family dynamics, to the bustling slave markets stretching from Scandinavia to Constantinople, these women shaped the Viking world in ways most history books don't show. Even the most horrifying cases, like ritual sacrifice, reveal the depth of the connection between women and Viking power structures. Their bodies, labor, and lives were tools used to cement authority, secure alliances, and maintain social hierarchies. And yet, despite the brutality, some women became key to cultural integration, like the Celtic women whose DNA helped populate early Iceland, leaving a permanent mark on the Viking legacy. Their stories force us to rethink what Viking history really is. It's not just epic long-ship battles or heroic sagas. It's also the untold human cost, the endless grind of enslavement, the chilling manipulation of social structures, and the terrifying rituals that marked the extremes of Norse belief. By recognizing their experiences, we gain a fuller understanding of Viking dominance, not just as conquerors, but as societies built on the subjugation and exploitation of women. So, when you picture Vikings today, remember this: for every saga of glory, there's a shadowed story of survival, suffering, and resilience. These women weren't just footnotes. They were the hidden backbone of a culture whose legends we still celebrate and whose darkness we're only just beginning to truly understand.